Everyone. My name is Shannon Bakey, and as the chair of the Vancouver Island Economic Alliance, I want to welcome you to the 15th Annual Economic Summit. I'm privileged to be welcoming you from the traditional territories of the Likwata people here in Campbell River. I would also like to acknowledge that Bahia operates across Vancouver Island in the territories of the Kwakwaka'wakw, New Channel, and Coast Salish, and we are fortunate and appreciative for the opportunity. Although we all hope to be able to gather for a hybrid summit this year, due to ongoing COVID-19 concerns, the summit is being held virtually again. The summit committee put together an informative agenda with broad-ranging topics and presenters, and we encourage you to attend as many sessions as you can. Every year through the summit, VAIA strives to bring together leaders, decision makers, and business to support a strong and diverse economy. Over the coming days, we encourage you to connect with those in attendance, as you never know when a new opportunity may arise or a great idea is generated. To learn more about VAIA and the various initiatives we are involved in, or to become a member, please visit vaia.ca. And now, to hear more about what to expect over the coming days, I would like to ask Dave Willey, Summit Committee Chair, to say a few words. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Shannon. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 15th Annual State of the Island Economic Summit, broadcast from the Vancouver Island Conference Centre in Nanaimo, BC, the traditional territory of the Tsunami First Nations. Since 2007, VAIA has been delivering this event from this location, and over the years, the summit has come to be known as the must-attend business event of the year. But for me, it's more than a business event, because business doesn't happen in a vacuum. Business happens within a social environment, affected by natural environments, of course, politics. And that's why this summit is attended by, yes, the business community, but also governments, including First Nations, by educators, and by folks from nonprofits, science, the arts, and even more. We've all been gathering every year for 14 years to tackle issues that affect everyone in Vancouver Island, with all the voices that matter brought to the table. Because when all the right voices are heard at the most relevant topics, more and better solutions will be found. I even believe that the disruptive nature of COVID has created even more opportunities for us to explore topics once we thought impossible. We'll be addressing obvious issues like post-pandemic economic recovery. We'll update you on VAIA pilot projects such as the Island Good, waste wood recovery, and foreign trade initiatives. But we'll also look at food security, how the arts and business communities can come together, and we'll be introducing Doughnut Economics, a transformative way of looking at progress that leaves nobody behind. We will also unveil our 7th Annual Economic Report, an unvarnished, tell-it-like-it-is annual read on the island economy. And we planned all this with a small, nimble staff, a large collective of volunteers, and the financial and in-kind support of a host of sponsors. And I want to thank each and every one of you for your contributions, and even more for your unselfish commitment to the island itself. I'm excited. I'm always excited just before the summit by what and who I'll hear from, by what others will learn, what they will come away with, and more importantly, how all this will transform what we at VAIA will do in response. Be prepared to take in as much as you can over the next couple of days. Connect with others as much as possible. This time we'll go fast, and before you know, we'll be planning our 22 event, which, where prayers are answered, will be up close and personal. I want to thank you. Have a wonderful summit. And now let me introduce George Hansen, our VAIA President, CEO. George, take it away.
At the opening of the Economic Summit a year ago, I suggested that we should consider ourselves lucky. Compared to pandemic impacts elsewhere in the world, we in the island region continue to be fortunate. And it is my hope that we will use this good fortune to reassess our priorities, act with a sense of urgency, and recognize that the practices that got us here will not get us out of here. Albert Einstein famously said, "We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them." It's clear that our business as usual methods for incremental change are thoroughly inadequate to our present circumstances. And it is not hyperbole to suggest that we have reached an existential nexus where our very survival is now in question. Urgent circumstances suggest bold response. Bold in questioning our usual practices, bold in our actions for positive change, and bold in answering the challenges that confront us. And here we come to the opportunity of the 2021 Economic Summit to allow our thinking to be challenged. Let Carlota Sanz of the Doughnut Economics Action Lab challenge your beliefs about economic development. Let the food doctor, Sylvain Charlebois of Dalhousie University, challenge your thinking about food production and security. Let Andrew Chunalal of Community Foundations of Canada challenge your opinions about philanthropy and local investment for a more equitable economy. And let Graham Truax of Innovation Island challenge your responses to the exponential changes we are experiencing. Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu said, if you don't change direction, you may end up where you are heading. I invite you to join our stellar cast of summit presenters to rethink our priorities and help change our direction towards a bold, transformative future for our island economy. It is now my distinct pleasure to welcome the Right Honorable Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada.
Hi everyone, bonjour à tous, and welcome to the 15th Annual State of the Island Economic Summit. For starters, I want to thank the Vancouver Island Economic Alliance for bringing us together today. As we work to finish the fight against COVID-19, it's important that we continue to look to and talk about the future. Je tiens donc à vous remercier de votre présence ici aujourd'hui et du travail que vous faites pour aider à bâtir des entreprises solides dans toute l'île de Vancouver. Et merci à tous d'avoir assisté à l'événement aujourd'hui. COVID-19 has been a difficult time for our economy and for businesses and their owners across Canada. But over the past 18 months, we've seen business owners and entrepreneurs step up. You adapted your businesses. You did what you could to keep your workers on the payroll, and you led with innovation and creativity to get through the tough times. Et nous avons été là depuis le début pour apporter un soutien. Lorsque la pandémie a frappé, notre gouvernement est intervenu immédiatement pour protéger les entreprises et notre économie et pour soutenir les Canadiens afin qu'ils puissent surmonter cette crise. From the wage subsidy to help employers keep Canadians on the payroll, to the Canada Emergency Business Account that helped cover operating costs with interest-free loans, we were there to help Canadian businesses stay afloat. And now, as more Canadians get vaccinated and more parts of the country reopen, we'll continue to be there to help you navigate the road ahead. Together, we will beat this crisis once and for all, and we will build a stronger and more resilient Canada for everyone. Merci et bon sommet.
Thank you, Prime Minister Trudeau. And now over to our opening session moderator, Dan Hurley of the Hurley Martin Group. Dan?
Thank you, George, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Dan Hurley, principal of the Hurley Martin Group and a director with the Vancouver Island Economic Alliance. I want to acknowledge with gratitude that VAIA operates on the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish, Nuu-Chulnut, and Kwakwaka'wakw peoples. And I'm speaking to you today from Gabriola Island on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Snuneymuxw peoples. We have an exciting and engaging 2 days for you. It begins with our opening keynote delivered by Carlota Sanz called Doughnut Economics, From a Radical Idea into Transformative Action. I will introduce Carlota in a moment, but first, here is a message from our sponsor for this session, the City of Nanaimo.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Leonard Krogh. I'm the Mayor of Nanaimo, one of the platinum sponsors of the Vancouver Island Economic Summit. I'm delighted to welcome all of you here today, and I'm particularly proud to introduce to you Ms. Carlota Sanz, who is one of the co-founders of the Doughnut Economic Model. She will be speaking today about Doughnut Economics, which is a concept that is all about transferring a radical idea into transformative change. This summit has always been a source of new ideas that will help us adapt to and become a resilient economy in the 21st century. Ms. Sanz is going to give us some assistance in leading the way. Delighted to welcome her, and I trust you'll all give her the welcome and the questions afterwards that will enable each of you to go back to your constituents, your members, and your friends and fellow co-owners of various businesses and build that 21st century economy. And most importantly, don't forget to visit the City of Nanaimo virtual booth.
Well, thank you, Mayor Krogh, and good morning, everyone. So what is Doughnut Economics? How does it work? And how is it creating ecologically safe and socially just cities and places around the world? Here to help explain this today is Carlota Sanz, co-founder of the Doughnut Economics Action Lab, or DEAL, and she's joining us today from Oxford, England. Before I hand it over to Carlota, though, I want to let you know that following her presentation, there'll be an opportunity to ask a few questions. We encourage you to enter your questions in the chat function that you can find at the bottom of your screen. So with that, I'm now pleased to welcome Carlota to begin her presentation. Over to you, Carlota. Good day.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dan, for the introduction. And I mean, a huge thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to share a bit of the work that we've been doing at Doughnut Economics Action Lab. So let me start by first sharing my screen, because, yeah, and we'll get us started. So just Dan, I'm checking, can you see perfectly my yellow screen?
Yes,
Right.
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Perfect. Right, so as I was saying, it's just a real big pleasure to be here with us. As Dan explained, I'm the co-founder of Doughnut Economics Action Lab. And as part of our work, we are bringing the ideas of this new economic mindset and model, Doughnut Economics, into action to create economies where people and planet thrive in balance. So I'm gonna share with you today the vision of our model and how we are starting to apply it in places and cities in the world. And I want to start by reflecting how the 21st century has begun, because unfortunately, the 21st century has started with repeated crises. From the financial crisis back in 2008 that impacted everyone in one way or the other, we are living in the era of climate collapse, and more recently, we are experiencing the hardness that the crisis generated by the global pandemic has made visible. Now, these crises are hitting the world hard and highlighting the great inequalities that persist of race and gender, of wealth and power between countries and others. But very importantly, these crises show us that we are really deeply interconnected with each other and with the rest of the living planet. And they show us that these crises arise from the very systems that humans have created, so they can be changed. Now, with this in mind, what I think it's clear is that we need a new vision for the 21st century. And funny as it sounds, I'm going to offer it in the shape of a donut. And what is a donut? Well, it's a compass to guide humanity, human prosperity in the 21st century, where the aim is to leave no one falling short of the essentials of life in the hole in the middle. So no one can be falling short of water, food, health, education. Now, these all were cross-sourced from the world's governments, from the Sustainable Development Goals, which means that all the governments in the world have agreed that every person has a claim in meeting these essential needs. So leave no one falling short, but at the same time, and this is a big but, we cannot overshoot the ecological ceiling, which is made from 9 planetary boundaries that are Earth's life-supporting systems that keep this unique, delicately balanced planet a home, sweet home for humanity and all the species here with us. So the aim is to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet and live inside that safe and just space that the donut offers. Now, if this is a new goal, the truth is that we are very far from reaching it, because all the red that this image shows is showing the extent to which people are falling short of the essentials of life and the extent to which humanity is already overshooting planetary boundaries. So on the one hand, billions of people are falling short on those social foundations. For example, that little red wedge that you see there represents the 11% of the world's population that still doesn't have enough food to eat today. And while there's still human deprivation worldwide, we have already collectively exceeded 4 of the planetary limits. So climate change is hitting harder and sooner. There's been excessive use of fertilizers on Earth, excessive land conversion, and catastrophic biodiversity loss. So the challenge that we have in the 21st century is to eliminate all the red that we're seeing in this page and to enter the donut from both sides. And this has never been done before. We are the first generation to see this picture and to realize that we need new solutions if we want to tackle this problem. Because last century's economic theories, conventional business models, or even traditional development policies were not designed to address this challenge. And this image shows the world as a whole. However, most policies take up at a national level. So I want to bring you to what happens when we see the country level. A group of researchers of the University of Leeds quantified 150 national donuts showing the national resource use associated with achieving a good life. And here I brought 3 examples. On the one hand, we have Rwanda, which is living within its fair share of planetary boundaries. However, it's massively falling short on meeting its people's needs. So the question here is, how can the country meet everyone's needs without overshooting these boundaries? On the other side of the spectrum, we have Canada, which is meeting everyone's needs, but they're massively overshooting on almost all of the planetary boundaries. So the question here is, how can a country like Canada come back within these planetary boundaries while still meet everyone's needs? And of course, these countries still have challenges in the social side. It's just that we are using a low global social bar in the study, and therefore those are the results that are showing. And also, it's important to understand that all the red outside the ecological ceiling in Canada, it's not resources that are necessarily mined or produced here, there. It's more about resources embedded in our food, in our clothing, in our electronics, in our construction materials that are imported all over the world. And then in the middle, we have countries like Chile, for instance, where they're still falling short on some of the essentials of life, but they're already as well overshooting the ecological ceiling. So this country has the double whammy of coming back to planetary boundaries at the same time as they provide everyone's needs. And of course, this research has used international comparable data taken from the UN datasets. So it doesn't look and it doesn't show specifically what are the realities of each country. But what it does, it gives you a very interesting pattern, a global pattern when we put all of these countries together. And so the place where we want to be in this graph, which is showing the 3 previous examples in the context of the 150 countries, is on the top left-hand corner, where we have met the needs of all people, but within the means of the living planet. And the first thing that we see is that there's no country close. So we're realizing that there's actually no such thing as developing countries or as developed countries, in the sense that every country is still in an unprecedented journey to this space. On the one hand, the countries below in the left, they need to progress in order to meet the needs of all people without pursuing the extraordinary, degrading and exploitative processes that other countries have pursued before. And so how can they do that? And what finance and assistance and technology and transformation of global trade rules are owed to them to make this possible? In the middle bottom right, so we have the middle income countries. And they have the double whammy of meeting their people's needs for the first time while already coming back to planetary boundaries. And many of these countries are in fact in a really pivotal moment of putting in massive infrastructure of housing, of transport, of energy, of communications. So how can we ensure that these infrastructural choices pivot them to the future that we want rather than lock them back in the old one? And finally, the richest countries on the planet, they need to sustain good lives for their peoples while reducing massively the overweight that they've already put in the living planets. And this has never been done either. So all of these three groups are in unprecedented journeys, right? So every country means that we'll need humility and ambition to make this happen. Wherever the country's transformative changes and a new economic mindset that help us tackle these challenges will be needed. And lastly, I want to point maybe the obvious in this picture, but I think it's worth mentioning that obviously these countries look like they're all completely separated from each other, but of course their own journeys are deeply interconnected with each other. Connected through the history of colonialism, through the ongoing relationships of military power, the structural adjustment rules imposed by the World Banks in the 80s, the finance and trade rules that are still imposed through international institutions, the ongoing extraction of and land grabs, and the current and future impacts of climate change. And predominantly, we see that a lot of these powers go from high-income countries impacting upon lower-income countries. So we need to see transformations within each nation, but also between the relationships of the nations. And so the question is, how can humanity get into the donut? And here we think that we need to transform fundamentally the dynamics of our economies and create economies that are distributive by design and regenerative by design. So I'm gonna explain a bit what I mean by these two. On the one hand, we have inherited a degenerative industrial system where industries are taking Earth's materials, making them into stuff, which we use them for a while, sometimes only once, and then we throw them away. And this linear take, make, use, lose dynamic is what is pushing us over planetary boundaries. And so what we need is we need to turn these arrows and create a regenerative and cyclical system by design, where we are using resources far more carefully, far more creatively, far more collectively. And so we will be working with and within the cycles of the living world. Let me show how this looks in practice. Here's some examples I brought. So from Oslo, making the city center car-free to get rid of fossil fuels, or Amsterdam's introducing a very, very ambitious circular construction regulation so that materials are used again and again and again. But also by regenerating the very ecology of a place. So for instance, we've got examples like sponge cities such as Kunli in China that are recognizing that floods will come. So don't try to concrete them over the water, welcome it and make a flood park. Or also the city of Medellin in Colombia. They have brought the biomimicry and nature back to the heart of the city, opening up the river and making river parks throughout the city, making it a place for people to gather and bringing back nature through the natural flow of that river, which is at the heart of the city. And this is only one part. We also need to recognize that we have inherited economies that have been designed in many ways through technology, through regulation, through enterprise, in ways that have tended to concentrate value and opportunity in the hands of a few. And this is why we are in the last decade still seeing the number of billionaires in the world going from 1,000 to 2,000 people. Opportunity and value continues to be concentrated in the very richest of hands. And we see these patterns all over the place. So what we need is to create societies that are distributed by design. We need to create opportunities and values we need to create economies where opportunity and value are shared far more equitably with all of the society here with us and who co-create it. And here's some examples of what being distributed by design could look like. For instance, in Preston in the UK. This is one of the places that is pioneering community wealth building, recognizing that every city and every administration has the power to use the purchasing power, their procurement in buying locally, in purchasing locally from small employee-owned, cooperatively owned enterprises here in the place in Preston. So they're really being an example of how can they use this purchasing power to create wealth in the community. But also, what about affordable housing? For instance, in the city of Vienna, over 60% of Vienna's residents live in social housing, which is owned either by the city municipality itself or in subsidized cooperatives. And this means that a lot of people live in good quality, affordable houses, which makes it really much more affordable city to live than many other major cities in the world. Also, living wages, for instance, in Seattle, in the United States, one of the first cities to introduce a living wage of $15 an hour, enabling everybody in that city to be certain of earning enough, right? And having a decent minimum wage. And of course, living wages are not enough to do it in one only place or in high income countries. We need to start thinking, what would it mean to recognize living wages in all of the global supply chains? And what is, of course, the role of multinational companies here? Bogota also, they are recognizing that there can be public luxury in small spaces, and they've turned these parking lots into a playground, making a place where people and community can be together and can build this fabric of community, of society. So this is also open common heritage, so important for a community and a place to thrive. And so these are the dynamics. We need to become regenerative by design and distributive by design. So then the question is, how can we use the donut also as a framework to getting us there, to live within the donut? And for this, DEAL has started to work with different places and cities. We have created a framework to downscale the donut to a place. And in fact, we started applying it at a city scale. So I'm going to talk through it a bit now about it. And I invite you to think of it from the lens, not specifically of a city, but also from any other scale or place that it might be relevant to you. So towns, regions, neighborhoods, because the framework works equally. So the question is, how can our city or town live within the donut? And so if we open that donut and unroll it, we can create a space where we can begin to envision the future that we want. And we can bring that social foundation, the ecological ceiling together and thinking of what it means to thrive here in our city, while also taking into account the relationships that we have with the rest of the world. So this is a space where we can start to reimagine and to recognize new possibilities. Let me deep dive into this space. Now, the framework starts by asking a very ambitious question. So I'm inviting you to listen it again from the lens of a city or a town or the settlement where you're living. How can a city or town become a home to thriving people in a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all the people and the health of the whole planet? And there's a lot in this question. So I'm going to break it down into the 4 questions that make up the 4 lenses of what we call the city portrait. So first one is, how can all the people of our city thrive? Next, how can our city be as generous as the wildland next door? But how can our city also respect the health of the whole planet? And how can our city respect the well-being of all the people? Let's start with the first one. How can all the people of our city thrive? So if you see along the bottom in this slide, I'm showing you all the icons that show the social dimensions that we can think of that cities and places care about. And of course, you can add as many and more specifics as you think that your city needs. But the important thing is that this framework invites you to ask the question, well, what does it mean to thrive for people here? And of course, the answer will only be relevant can only be answered by the people in Berlin or in Bogota. So it's very different in each city or place where you ask that question. But also we can get the chance to ask, well, what has COVID-19 made visible about inequalities, about poverty, about deprivation that has always been there, but maybe it was not being made so visible until now? And also, how can we, if we want to transform as a community, well, what are our secret strengths? What are the values? What is maybe the strength in diversity, or it may be cultural connection. It might be pride in our city's history. And what are all of those values that will enable us to pivot and to use them to move forward? And then the next question puts the place and the city in the context of their natural habitats. So how can our city be as generous as the wildland next door? Where on planet Earth is your city? And if we were to take me to the wildland next door, then where would we be going? And what is nature doing there? How is nature's genius and learning to clean the air and to house biodiversity, to store carbon, to cycle water, to harvest solar energy, regulates the temperature, protects the soil? And how can our cities store as much carbon and house wildlife? And we know that, for instance, trees are magic solutions for a lot of these questions. So how can our city harvest solar energy, through solar panels or through urban rooftops farms? And how can your city manage better the water and build soil, recognizing flooding, which may happen, and how it can be absorbed as part of that city rather than rejected? And of course, taking this approach will also build the city's adaptation and resilience to climate impacts. So these two questions set out our local aspiration to be thriving people in a thriving place. But of course, as we all know, every city and town in the world is drawing resources from elsewhere, from some places all over the world. And so we need to set this local aspiration in the context of the global responsibility. So how can our city respect the health of the whole planet? Where is the timber coming from, the food, the water resources? Where are the carbon emissions being emitted around the world in the name of our city's prosperity? And how can the city come back within planetary boundaries, reducing its impact on climate change, the use of fertilizer on earth, the water use, the land conversion? How can we transform mobility so that it enhances local life, but also massively cuts carbon emissions? How do we create a circular economy to massively reduce that reliance on stream of construction materials, on consumer goods, on food? How do we transform food systems in the city, thinking about the global impact of how the city eats? And now let's think of the city, of the people. So let's think of those global supply chains still, but the people involved in them, that we are all connected to. So think of all the companies that are based in your city and what are the business models that are operating in, because they may be influencing a lot the lives of people worldwide if they're hiring people elsewhere. But also think of the multinational brands and retailers selling in the shops of your city, and what are the labor rights of people, because a lot of the labor behind those labels is often exploitative and it's hidden from our view. And this is still part of our history and part of our story, of the story of our city. And now let's pull back. And if we look at this canvas, we can see that we can use it to explore the city's future. So for example, if we think of extending our housing future in the city, then we can start thinking, well, what would it mean to create housing for community that's affordable, that enables parents to care for their children, that builds community, that builds connection? But also, how can we create housing that connects us with nature, that cools the air, that houses biodiversity, that begins to be as generous as the wildland next door? And of course, think of how we're building that housing in a way that reduces our use of fossil fuels, our use of materials. Can we be circular? Can we be cyclical? Can we be using more solar energy? And how can we ensure that we are respecting the rights of the people who made that cement on the other side of the world, perhaps, or even migrants, workers that are coming into the city to do that construction? So taking care of all of these aspects means that we are taking a holistic view. And we can start by plotting, right, and seeing all the existing targets that a city has already committed with respect to housing in this case, and also see what's going on already in motion and celebrate what's happening and what's working well, because we want to learn from that. And we can see our challenges, and we can see how many new initiatives might be popping up, but more importantly, we can see all of the interconnections between each other. We've used this framework to run policymaking workshops with some of the few cities that began engaging with the 4 lenses of the Doughnut City portraits. These pictures were taken before the pandemic, and they show workshops in Philadelphia, Amsterdam, Portland, where we invited their city officials of the cities to sit around the portrait of their own city. And what we found in these workshops is that sitting in front of this city portrait was really empowering for these people working in these cities, because each person could recognize their issue, their sector, but see it in a context of a whole and draw new connections, draw new synergies, possibilities that were not visible before, when the city was working in a much more siloed way. And they've also told us how it became obvious that if they're going to transform the outcomes of the city, then they also need to transform the way that they're working. And we need to look at the way in which we have a power to change and how can we transform that. And so along with this framework to downscaling the donut, we are also thinking about the deep design of cities. And again, you can think it and apply it to other scales, so from towns to nations to regions. And the truth is that some cities are still asking this question: how can we make our city grow? As if success only would show up in the GDP of the city. However, city policy makers that we've been talking to, they tell us that they sometimes feel quite pressured to talk about this, because actually what they think that success looks like, it's really about people seeking for a good life here. And so they want to really be asking the question of how can we make our city thrive? How can we meet everyone's needs within the means of the living planet? And so what enables a city to pivot from one to the other? We believe that there are 5 design traits that are hugely influential in what a city or an institution can be and do in the world to make this transformation happen. And I'm going to briefly talk through them. First of it, the purpose. So if we want to serve a city where the purpose is to thrive and to live within planetary boundaries, then we need an ambitious vision and purpose, right? So for instance, Amsterdam has taken and used the framework of the donut to frame their wider circular ambition within the social ambition as well. The city of Melbourne has created its own visualization of what would thriving mean for their community. And it doesn't need to be the donuts, but the important thing here is that we need to have and agree a powerful vision that is taking where we want to be. But also think of the networks of the city. So how is your city networked? How is it holding citizens' assemblies, or whether it's also creating circular city scans that connect industries, or joining progressive alliance, right? Like the cities of the C40 or ecologically cities, because a lot of the power of these networks will hold that city to learn from others and to the real purpose that they're trying to achieve. But also, how is the city governed? And again, this is all through the way in which the city is operating. We need to think about, are we setting enough ambitious regulations? Like Amsterdam, I'll speak a bit more about them, but they have a really ambitious regulation in construction, in circular construction. But also using experiments in policy making, like Finland has been doing for a long time, learning from what's working, what's not working. So leaving that space to really experiment, because the challenges that we have need experimentation to come up with new solutions. And also using humor for behavioral change. For instance, in Bogota, I thought that was brilliant. They employed clowns to mock and change the traffic behavior of the people. And then ownership. This is a crucial question. Who owns the resources of wealth creation in your city, and how can that be changed? So I spoke about housing in Vienna, so land and housing is very important, but also utilities. So for instance, Paris has brought back the water utility from being privatized, now back under public control, so it can shape the future of its water history in the future. But also, who owns the data? Right, bringing the ownership of data back to citizens. Barcelona is pioneering actually a very innovative and radical approach to how they are making data open. But also businesses, of course, businesses are so important. For instance, in Atlanta, in the US, they have 5 times more Black-owned business than many other surrounding cities, because they've played an intentional role of encouraging minority-owned entrepreneurship and small enterprise in that place. So who owns the businesses obviously also matters. Finally, how is our city financed? How can the city use its budgeting cycle to create a well-being budget, as it's happening in New Zealand and in Santa Monica? How can we be using the procurement to purchase locally, to purchase within its values? And how can also a city divest and invest its own funds, like its pensions, for instance, to bring about the future that we want to bring? And so think about these 5 design traits, and yeah, what are the design traits that are still drawing us back to that extractive mindset, and what are those that are already bringing us forward to the future that we want. And of course, that the city or a specific level cannot do everything, right? We need to think of cities being in a context of a nation, and perhaps within regions like the EU and internationally. So of course, there are regulations and conditions that shape what each level can do. But spanning this out and having like conversations that identify these different powers to act can then ask, well, what can a city stop doing now because it's within their power to act? Or what can we do start as a city to doing differently because it's within our power to act? And of course, then what are all the other things that we need to be working together across the different levels? And I'm going to finish now by telling a bit of the work that we've been doing in practice, the example. So I spoke about Amsterdam. This was the first city that created a city donut portrait. You can see the image below in that slide. We held many workshops discussing and using the donut as a framework for the city as they began to create their circular city strategy. And they've used very powerfully, I think, the visual also of the donut to represent a very ambitious purpose to be a thriving, inclusive, regenerative city for all while respecting the planetary boundaries. This is a high-minded purpose, and of course, it must be backed by the other design traits that I just mentioned. But more concretely, they have a very ambitious circular strategy, which has turned out in a very ambitious regulation. So they want to be 100% circular by 2015. They want to be 50% circular by 2030, within a decade, and to purchase 10% circular procurement in all government contracts from next year. So this is giving a long, loud legal message to everyone, especially to businesses that will have to transform the way they are producing to meet and to be part of this transformation. And to me, boundaries unleash creativity, and setting these boundaries in place give a clear signal to everyone and to everybody that it's creative and innovative, that this is a place to demonstrate that new things can happen. And what we're seeing in these places and in Amsterdam is that architects and planners are really embracing these regulations and finding themselves at the front edge of circular and innovation design with skills to share elsewhere. So Amsterdam, it's clearly putting the donut at the heart of their circular strategy. And they are now moving into creating the new metrics. So what are the new metrics and the new data that they need in order to monitor what progress they're doing towards that ambition? They released publicly the city portrait in April 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, and they embraced publicly that they would use the donut as their conceptual framework to emerge from the pandemic with a new vision and direction. And while the city leaders were adopting the framework, in parallel there was also a coalition of residents forming the Amsterdam Donut Coalition to drive change from the bottom up. We've shared this methodology that we've used for everyone to look at and to inspire others that might want to do the same. And what we're seeing is that the inspiration between some places and others is just incredibly powerful. There are already towns and cities all around the world that have followed Amsterdam and are creating their own adaptation of this methodology and of these 4 lenses. Not only in cities, as I was saying, we're seeing it happen at different scales, from neighborhoods such as Birmingham, or regions such as Brussels, nations like Costa Rica or Curacao. I mentioned Brussels, so the Regional Secretary of State for Economic Transition, Barbara Tracht, launched the Brussels Donut Project, which was aimed to explore the various ways of implementing the donut economy in the Brussels capital region. And it's aiming to make the donut a shared compass to be used by all actors of the region to reimagine that future and to make coherent decisions in favor of ecological and social transition. We've also seen Copenhagen voting to have their finance administration exploring donut economics for city planning. And the council has very recently accepted a proposal to establish a donut economics unit within the city. So we are really excited about how these concepts are being picked up in different places, in different ways, and about this pioneers wanting to experiment what this all means in their context. And as I was saying, it's not only led by governments. We are seeing coalitions and groups of people just self-organizing and picking up the concept. I mentioned Amsterdam, and this has also inspired groups worldwide who have started to self-organize in place-based groups and using and adapting the framework in their own contexts. There's now a global community, and so it's becoming clear that there's so much energy and interest in organizing in this way. So let me summarize and finish, but just recognizing that if humanity is to get into the donut, then we need to create economies and cities and settlements that are regenerative by design and that are distributive by design. So how can we put these dynamics at the very heart of our strategies, at the heart of our metrics of success? How could we use the 4 lenses of the city portrait that I explained to create holistic strategies to ensure that we are thinking about local ambition, but also within global responsibilities? And let's recognize that we all have different powers to act across our purpose, our networks, our governance, our ownership, and our finance. And so there will be places where city can act now, but there will be others that we need collaboration and integration within the different levels. And if all of this sounds interesting to you, I also want to invite you to come and visit our platform, Doughnut Economics Action Lab online, which is the platform that connects and empowers the community of change makers that are already turning the ideas of the donuts into action. And we're just delighted to see how these concepts are being uptaken. We truly believe that spreading these ideas this way from change maker to change maker, experimenting, learning from each other is the most effective way that we found to bring about transformative change in a decade where there is really no time to lose. Thank you very much. I'll stop here and I really look forward to the conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Carlota. A really great presentation and a great deal to think about as we start off our summit this year. We've got lots of questions coming in on the chat, so thank you, everyone. Please keep them coming in. We've got about 10 minutes to go through some of our questions, so I'll ask as many as we can. And a reminder for those who really want to dive into the topic, there is a session, one of our breakout sessions today is on Doughnut Economics in the context of the city of Nanaimo. But a quick question for you, Carlota. Will we be able to have your slides and share that with our participants?
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. Excellent. And yeah, there's all of the material also apart from my slides. As I say, if anyone is interested in diving a bit more, there's a lot of resources and videos in the platform. So I'll share those and also point to our platform to get more.
That's great. Okay, thank you so much for that. So a question for me to start off with. In terms of thinking about the Vancouver Island region, we already know you're working very closely with the city of Nanaimo, a city of just over 100,000 people. But a lot of our region, our community is much smaller than that. Most, I would say, are less than 25,000, if not smaller. And I'm just wondering if you could comment, because many of the examples you're using are large urban centers. Mm-hmm. How would you recommend, how could Doughnut Economics be applied, the Doughnut model be applied to smaller, rural, and remote communities?
Sure, this is a great question. And as I said, we started with cities, and I shared more from an angle of a city, because that's where we started. That's where the energy was when we started to think of applying. And there was a lot of interest from some urban places, and recognizing that there's, of course, a lot of space to experiment. And there seems to be a lot of leadership willing to experiment in the space of cities. But of course, this is everything that I've shared today. It's by no means only applicable to a city level. So what we're seeing is that, in fact, since we published all the resources, the methodology, the different tools that I've very briefly shared today, they've been picked up by very different places and very rural as well. So we are seeing examples, for instance, in England, regions like Cornwall, like Devon, which are mostly populated by very rural small towns, are starting to use the same framework of those 4 lenses, and we're starting to see how they are also adapting to what it means to different kinds of settlements, so not only urban. So I guess my invitation is to look at, we are now also, a lot of the work that we're doing at Deal is to also document and share the practices that we're seeing emerging in different places that might be different to each other. So a lot of the work that we're doing in the platform is to share those stories of practice. And I can point to some of those stories that could maybe talk to a bit more rural kind of approach to it, of rural settlements approaching to it. But I think the questions that I've put here really apply to almost every scale. In fact, yeah, we're seeing them used in England, for instance. There's also a very amazing pioneer neighborhood in the city of Birmingham, which are using this framework to co-create a new neighborhood in a very, very non-privileged place and quite deprived. So we are seeing it also taking it with a completely different angle. So the space for adapting, that's what I think it's very useful. Like, we are inviting people to adapt and to think, what would that look like in their place? And again, I started and I show it in cities because that's where we started, but we're certainly starting to work more at different scales.
Great, thank you so much for that. Next question has to do with the living wage. How does productivity and the number of hours work and fit into the definition of a living wage?
Very good question. I mean, this is an open question, and I think that I'm probably not going to have the exact answer to it, and I'm going to be very open to it. But we need to think about what productivity really means, and what is the productivity that we want to have, and towards which purpose, right? So, I mean, what it's clear is that everyone deserves a certain amount of living wage so that they can afford, the basic needs in a place. And so it's for businesses and for the places and the cities to actually establish what that means in their place, which is going to be very different. And so what productivity means in one place will be very different to the other. But I think that for me, the question is like, well, what do we need to definitely reassure or assure in our city, to our citizens, to our residents, let's say in a place, so that they can afford a good life here. And that, of course, is going to depend very differently in each of the places.
Yeah, understood. So based on your research, in the cities that have most successfully adopted the donut model, is there a trend as to who initiates and drives the change? For example, is it governments? Is it business? Is it grassroots and community organizations or individuals? What are sort of some of your best practices with that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we're also learning actually as we're seeing. But I think that some patterns are emerging. I mean, I think there's a mix, to be fair. I mean, it's predominantly driven by either local administrations or by the community and the residents. In fact, and businesses are, of course, part of the conversation, and we need to have a conversation about what does this all mean for business and what are the transformations that we need to see in the world of business. That's another talk, actually, that I'm very happy to point to some of our videos online. But definitely we're seeing coming from different places, and we are working at a lot in both, from government-led and community-led. And I think the magic happens when a place has both, right, and both merge together. And so, for instance, in Amsterdam, what we saw is that the initiative was kind of initiated and led by the government at the beginning, as they were trying to bring together their circular strategy with a wider economic kind of change. But then in parallel, a coalition formed, right? And Amsterdam, I think not only the Doughnut Coalition, but I think Amsterdam has a very strong also resident mobilization. So we've been seeing them now work a lot in parallel, and you see how they're taking also making themselves accountable and working together. So I think the magic comes when the different the different actors in society, in a place, come together and drive and adopt the framework and these ideas in the same way. So yeah, I think in each place it's happening differently, really. Absolutely.
And then what about population? How does that factor into Doughnut Economics? Comment is, we seem to be reluctant to discuss the root of the problem, which is overpopulation. So wondering how this fits into your framework.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question. So population matters. Of course, it matters, how many people are alive on the planet, right? So if we want a world in which every person can meet their essential needs, right, that matters. Now, I think the trajectory of human population is actually a good story, because if we see as how the curve of population growth is, the truth is that it's no longer exponential, it's logistic, or it follows the S-curve. So like living systems, they grow up and now they are kind of plateauing. And so the question is where and at which level it plateaus, right? And I think that the question here, obviously, like we know already what needs to be done and what humanity needs to do to plateau at a level that we can obviously do this. So we need to have child health, meaning that parents can believe that their child will live beyond the 5 of age so that they don't have as many, but girls' education to respect girls' rights to acknowledge their opportunities, women's reproductive health, right? So that women can make their own decisions about their bodies, women's empowerment. So I think that, I think the population is a great question, but we need to obviously, think that that's actually, I think right now, one of the good news, in the sense that population is no longer exponentially growing. It's at what level we plateau, and we have the mechanisms to actually control that. And lastly, we also need to talk about, if we speak about population, I think we also need to talk about distribution of wealth, and how, the 1%, it's holding more than 50% of the wealth in the planet, and that is having a big impact in the world. And so if we speak about population, we definitely need to speak about inequality as well, and how the overshoot and where the overshoot is coming from, and in which parts of the population.
So related to that, how do you see capitalism, which is arguably the overarching problem outside of a given political jurisdiction, be influenced to give the doughnut economy a fighting chance? So how does capitalism adapt, or can it, to doughnut economics?
Yeah, I mean, we to be honest, at Deal, find that the word capitalism, it's sometimes not that useful, because everyone understands very different things of what capitalism is. So are we talking about capitalism as how we are having the power in production and labor? Are we talking about capitalism in the need of pursuing endless growth? So we would have to unpack what we are talking about in capitalism, but I guess that what we are definitely calling for is for a change of narrative, in which capitalism, what is definitely, or the current system, or we have inherited a system that seems to be addicted to endless economic growth. And this, we at Deal are agnostic to growth, meaning that growth will be needed in some places, and definitely growth will be needed in especially low income countries, where they still need to develop. But the extent to which economies can grow or can be dependent on endless economic growth, that needs to be questioned, because there is yet no evidence at the moment that say that by growing endlessly, we'll be able, even if we grow green, we'll be able to decouple, and so to the extent that we need to make. So of course we need to reconsider what the purpose of our economy is, and ask ourselves the question: is the question actually about GDP and economic growth, or is the question about really thriving and having economies that are thriving? And yeah, we do need to question this, and we are questioning these questions. And the answer, as I say, is different, of course, and has many different implications in the different countries and in the different levels of incomes that we have in the different countries.
Well, Carlota, thank you so much. There's a lot more questions here that we can't get to, but again, there is a session starting shortly where you'll be able to dive into this a bit more. So thank you so much for joining us today. A really interesting topic with lots to think about.
Thank you very much, everyone. And I really hope that you enjoy the rest of the event and the rest of the sessions. And yeah, I'll be later talking a bit more about the case of Nanaimo. And yeah, I just invite you to continue questioning. Those are really great questions. And I think that we're all trying to figure out the answers together as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to the City of Nanaimo for your sponsorship of this session. And if you want to hear more, as stated, on applying Doughnut Economics, then please join the concurrent session at 10:30, beginning at 10:30. And we also have 2 other engaging sessions on the Indigenous economy and mental health in the workplace. So lots to participate in this morning at our summit. And don't forget, we have the virtual trade show and networking opportunities throughout the summit. So there's nothing that replaces the in-person component of our summit, of course, but we have a really great platform here. We have many exhibitors who have their booths. We really appreciate them participating, so please visit them. And also to network with fellow delegates. There's the ability to set up meetings and to have a chat and to talk about these ideas and keep asking these questions that we've started on today. So also lots of contests and games too, and prize draws. Island Good is a factor in all this, so please participate. Anyway, great couple of days in store for us here at the State of the Island Summit. Thanks very much for joining us this morning, and we will see you in the next few days.